Well, hello, everybody. My name's Aubrey Dunn. I'm from New Mexico. I'm the New Mexico Land Commissioner. I'm kind of a neophyte to politics. I've only been in about 2 years. This is my first position. It's a statewide position in New Mexico. I've been lucky enough to score some pretty good hits today. With me, I have Senator Pete Domenici, who has been 40 years within and service as a senator from New Mexico. And I'd like, thank you. I didn't realize it till we spoke earlier today, but he actually started as a teacher before he became a lawyer. So what you've ended up with today is you've got a teacher, lawyer turned politician, and then you've got a teacher, legislator who turned politician, Congressman Bishop, and we welcome you today. He's got 30 years experience both in state legislature and then with Congress, so thank you for being here.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Yeah, I'm happy to be here with you.
What we're going to try and do, and then, I lucked out, and then I got Newt Gingrich behind me, and so everybody's here, so I'm going to use it to my fullest. And I'll get done quickly. I'm a banker and for 25 years, and then I got into ranching. We've got about 41 section ranch in New Mexico, which is roughly 3% of Rhode Island. So when you look at New Mexico, it's a different state. And we even though it's 3% of Rhode Island, we can only run about 400 cows on it. But, and then as a banker, I had a pretty good career. We sold out in 2007 before the crash, which a lot of people think I was pretty smart, but lucky always works. And so we sold out in 2007. And one of the things I wanted to talk about as far as banking, when I was in business, I had different rules I like to go by. And one was, I never wanted to be in a business that I couldn't operate myself. Number two, I always wanted to partner with somebody that had 10 times the net worth I had. I learned that by example. And number three, I had a guy named Ron who worked with me, and he said, if there's a card in the deck, somebody's going to play it. And that's how we kind of did our business planning, is if there was a card in the deck, someone's going to play it. Meaning if we had a business decision we were trying to do, we'd take into what our competitors would do. And I think it's really relevant to what happened 3 weeks ago. And I don't know how many of you played spades, but it's a card game, and there's an ace of spades, and that's called the trump card. And, and I think that's what got played 3 weeks ago. So... So I'll get started. Tried to liven it up. I've got Laura Riley with me from our office. I want to thank her for being here. She's down here in front, so whenever I get in on a bad joke, she does cut it. And then I'd like to thank the Chases with Gold New Mexico, and Tara Hedrick's here with PAN, Protect America Now. So they were sponsors today, so thank you for allowing me to be here. So I'll go through a real quick slide discussion. The other thing is I am an auctioneer. I went to auctioneer school in 2008. And so I do know the auctioneer chant. It's about a week class. And so I can talk pretty quick. I'm a $100 bid, now two, would it give me now two, would it give me now two? So I'm a fast-talking politician now. But this is New Mexico. This is actually part of our state trust lands. And not many people know about state trust lands because if you're from the East, you don't have them anymore. They were sold off. But state trust lands came from Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson had a view that to have an educated public, we needed to have a good school system. So each state, as they came into the Union, got Section 16. And they were generally sold, but it was done because he thought for our republic to go forward, we needed to have an educated public. And so that's where state trust lands came from. By the time New Mexico and Arizona came in, to the Union, we were given 4 sections. And so right now, my job is to manage 4 sections of state trust lands to benefit education in New Mexico. It's about 9 million acres surface, which is bigger than 8 of the smallest states in the nation. I've got 13 million mineral acres, and that's what we manage to generate income that ranges from $400 million to $800 million in a year that goes into education. We have a permanent fund that has $15 billion in it, and it's a great thing, but it all came from Thomas Jefferson. Our beneficiaries are common schools, Military Institute, New Mexico State University, University of New Mexico, the penitentiary, and other things is what we work on. And when you look at Western states, all the Western states have land commissioners pretty much. There's only 5 of us that are elected. Myself, Texas, Arkansas, South Dakota, and Washington. So we're statewide. Most of them are appointed by governors, and so the governor's gotten control of that. She'd like to get control of me too. So in New Mexico, this is kind of a breakdown where our income comes from. We get grazing about 7%. Oil and gas brings in from 92 to 90%. This is what we were able to generate last year. And so when you look at it, we do great things with the lands that we have, and that's kind of the talk about Western states being in control of their own lands. In New Mexico, when you look at the big map there, the blue areas on the map are state trust lands. And if you notice, they're checkerboarded. The yellow are Indian lands, the green are Forest Service, and the yellow is BLM. And then the white is private land. In New Mexico, by the slide, 43%, less than half our land's private. The federal government controls 34%, state trust controls 11%, and the Indians control almost 11% now too. So when you talk about land management, we've got some really federal issues. BLM nationwide owns 261 million acres, 700 million mineral acres, but the thing I want to talk about today, they own 58 million acres of non-federal surface, meaning it's split estate. And that came about in 1910. They decided whenever we were doing homesteading that they would start splitting off the surface from the minerals. And then in 1916, as people came in and homesteaded the western states, they were given 640 acres and the federal government reserved the minerals. So what happened is you created private land on the top and federal minerals on the bottom. If you look at western states, New Mexico has 9.5 million split estate acres. You can see Wyoming and Montana have over 11 million acres. And so there's private land on the top, federal land on the bottom. And that's Colorado and Wyoming I've got up. In the red is the areas where there's private land and federal minerals. This is the western states again, and the yellow is BLM, the gray is national forest, the orange is tribal lands, and then the other is oil and gas development. And when you look at New Mexico down here in the lower right-hand corner, that area there for oil and gas development is the Permian Basin. With new finds in the Permian Basin and new technology and drilling, the Permian Basin now, which includes Texas, a large portion is in Texas, has enough energy in it to power our country, solely our country, for 80 years. Originally, about 2 years ago when I was running for office, it was 40 years. But with the new finds in oil, the Permian Basin can produce enough oil to run our country for 80 years. Solely. That's one of the big things. That's why we're having the problem with the Saudis and the others, because they're trying to crash the price to keep us from producing. When you talk about what challenges we have when we talk about public lands, the Antiquities Act is a big one. We've had 2 monuments that come into New Mexico. We've got over 162,000 acres. Already tied up in national monuments. These 2 came in. The top one, Rio Grande del Norte, it's up by Taos. It has 40,000 state trust acres in it, and the Laurel and Oregon Mountain Peaks has 70,000 acres of state trust lands. And when they put them in the monuments, we slowly lose our ability to earn any lands from it or any income from it. So it's one of the issues we have. We're trying to trade out with the BLM, but the bureaucracy is just so great it's hard to do. The other one of the big impediments to our being able to develop in New Mexico, and why it's a big deal in western states, is because of the federal land, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife is able to go in and create all these new endangered species. I mean, the latest one is this Texas hornshell mussel that's in the southern part of New Mexico. It's in the middle of the oil field play. They've taken over 400,000 acres and it's only in one creek. And they're going to try and shut down oil and gas development in New Mexico because of this species. The other issue we really have is our forests are poorly managed and our watersheds are in terrible shape. We have huge fires. We had one called the Doghead just outside of Albuquerque this last year. It destroyed tons of natural resource, and after the big burn, the floods that come after destroy the watershed for generations. So we've got a BLM. They've created a bunch of new federal rules, venting and flaring, onshore orders 3, 4, and 5, and so we're just fighting a lot of issues. And the reason we have problems is because our lands are intermixed with those federal problems. The thing I really wanted to talk about, and what the panel is going to talk about with me today, is a crazy idea I've come up with, and I call it early childhood education. New Mexico ranked 48th in well-being in children. We ranked 50th in education, and not on the top, it's the bottom. We're 44th in health. We're 48th in family and community. Our child poverty rate is 30%. 146,000 kids are in child poverty with incomes and family of 4 of less than 23,000. So I've been, as a land commissioner, you know, I'm not a legislator like you all, so I can't make rules, but I do manage the lands. And so I had this idea that we should transfer the federal minerals under split estate to the state land office to manage, to generate money for income, to handle some of our early childhood issues. And so that's really what we want to talk about today. As you see in western states, it's a big deal. What we will do, though, to offset, you know, the loss to the federal government, actually we get half the minerals already. For the first 10 years, and we would propose that whatever we generate, we'll pay half back to the federal government. So I think it's a great idea. It's out of the box. It doesn't affect hunters or fishermen at all. We're not affecting any of the BLM surface lands. We're only talking about federal minerals under private land. And in New Mexico, this is what it looks like. The pink is all the federal minerals under private land. As you see in Lee and Eddy County in the corner, that's our really hot spots for oil and gas, but the whole state is rich in natural resources. We estimate that we could bring in, based on our current income numbers of our other lands, the 13 million we have, we could bring in over $200 million in income to the state. It won't start immediately, it's a long-term plan. We'll create jobs in the manufacturing, and we'll create a stream of funding for early education within our state. One thing we do need is congressional approval, and that's why I've got these gentlemen with me. And this is the ranch in New Mexico where I live. These are my 3 granddaughters, and that's why we do it. So, gentlemen, I hope you're ready to tackle this, and we'll talk about it. So thank you. You ready? We'll start with you, Senator, if that's okay.
You want to start with me?
Yeah, you've got your notes right there with you, I think.
Everything ready?
Yes, sir. So I want to thank everybody for time to coming here today. And Senator Domenici, I know you have a desire for New Mexico and children in New Mexico and conservation. And I'd like to start off with the talks with you, but could you mention some things about early childhood needs, not just in our state, but nationally?
Well, first, let me again repeat who I am. I'm Pete Domenici. I served in the United States Senate for 36 years as a senator from New Mexico. I retired about 8 or 9 years ago and lived here and watched this building and many like it spring up within the last 5 years, 20 or 30 of them, a lot of growth. I was asked by a public servant whether I could be helpful, and I said, in what? He said, would you help us find a way to get more resources dedicated and devoted to early childhood education? Now, you all know that a state like New Mexico, being very poor, has problems funding education properly. That's the case. On the other hand, we do have assets that are valuable that are sitting dormant, and nobody's using them. So I was asked, do you think we could come up with a way of transferring some land that would hurt no one and would generate revenue for early childhood development? And obviously, when you look at the rib count, you see that nationally, early childhood education is inadequate. When you look at New Mexico, it's not only inadequate, but we're right down near the worst, the bottom of the run. So I'm not going to list how and how many dollars and how much. I can just tell you that if we were to put the states up there and say how much is being devoted from various sources for early childhood development, you'd be very frightened for the mothers and fathers of children who have to live through this, and you'd be wondering how they're going to get a proper education so that they can move on to the adult life, having the development of their brain and of their capacity through appropriate education. So, Commissioner Dunn and those in the audience who make up this excellent working group that helps with situations like ours, let us just say to you, this fellow Pete Domenici, an old man, is knocking at your door saying, we're going to ask you to help us because we think you know that we want to start somewhere on this problem of education disabilities, and this is where we think we can do the best for our children. Now, we're pleased to answer questions in due course, but I want to say this is the first appearance by me in the last, almost the last year. I am growing unaccustomed to speaking before large audiences, but I hope I was at least audible, and I hope I said something reasonable. I can assure you that in my day, I note you have Newt Gingrich on your. I could even stand up to him. When he shows up here this afternoon, if I'm still here, I'll take my commissioner with me because he's a big man. And we'll go see Newt and ask him if what I told you is a truism or if I was just puffing. And, I believe he would say, you got a hold of that Domenici, you better hold tight because he's have to throw you into the zoo and you'll be in trouble. But let me say to the land commissioner, I used the land commissioner to tell everybody in New Mexico I was coming home, and neither of us thought that they were that interested, but it got a great big story about me coming home to New Mexico, and I wondered what they want of me, but I'm taking this issue back with me, so I'll be helping with it. I want to thank you. I hope you enjoyed this food. I want to tell you I cannot understand where the growth is coming from here in the District of Columbia. About every 6 or 8 days, dedicating a new skyscraper, five stories underground, 11 stories above ground. Everyone's like that. I don't know where all the money comes from, But I guess I've concluded that low interest at least causes building to get built. It's sometimes empty.
Well, Senator, I hate to tell you that, but I believe that they're taking it from the rest of us and sending it to
Well,
D.C.
They
So,
just might. They just might. They just might. And I want to say to you, public land issues. It looks to me, if you heard the president-elect last night iterate what he expected as an energy policy, it is clear that those objectives and goals cannot happen without the development of the public lands in an appropriate and reasonable manner. You can't get there without it. So I think it's fair to say that we're doing the president-elect's work when we talk about the kind of things you work on with reference to land, public land in the future. Not distant future, now, within the next couple of years. Thank you for listening.
you bet. You bet. Thank you, sir. Congressman Bishop, you know, I've been a big fan, and I think you've led the charge on trying to return states' rights back to the states and local government, which is best when it's closest to the people. And, you know, I know that we're kind of on the same board, and Utah has some of the similar issues we have. Would you care to go through some of those and share with us kind of your thoughts on public lands and what we're talking about on this bill later?
And education?
Yes, sir.
Look, you've covered a couple of things that are there. First of all, I would be surprised if there is any state represented out here that's not one of the original 13 that was not promised in their Enabling Act that they would get their unappropriated lands back. Originally, the federal government used to sell territorial lands as a way of getting money for the federal government. And it was kind of like a quit deed language that was put into your Enabling Acts, but there was the promise always that eventually it would get them back. The idea of holding them is a recent decision, and it has a negative impact on everyone's education. If you look at the states that have the hardest effort in building their public education budgets and the states that have the most amount of federal land, it's almost like a one-to-one relationship.
I agree.
Every state that's east of Denver over the last 20 years has raised their public education budget by 68%. Those of us who are in the public land west of Denver, have raised it by 35%. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. So the inability of the West to adequately fund an education system does go back to the inequality that comes with the land. And when you talked about energy, you're spot on as well. The United States has become an energy leader in the world, but it's all been done on private and state land so far.
Right.
If indeed we are going to become a permanent energy leader so that we can be a benefit to our allies, it has to be developed on federal lands and offshore, especially the Gulf and the Arctic. And unfortunately, those two areas are all the purview of my committee. So if we're going to be a leader in energy, it's going to have to come through the Resource Committee as we start moving in these directions. And if we're going to fund education properly, we've got to start looking at these resources and developing them. As I think, you know, I look at wilderness and let's use that as a currency. We're not necessarily opposed to wilderness as long as it gets us something that actually helps people as well to develop their resources and their recreation opportunity and their education opportunities. And there's enough land in the West to accommodate all of those things.
No question.
agree. Yes, sir. One of the things I didn't really talk about, but I had the lizard up there on the screen. In New Mexico, we have the prairie chicken and the lizard, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has said that we can no longer build overhead power lines to well pad sites. And in doing so, we have to put in big trenches and put power underground. And now we're required by the federal government, or by Fish and Wildlife, that the oil company or whoever's putting in this power line, when they open the ditch up, they have to have a guy who's called a lizard watcher. And the lizard watcher actually gets paid $2,000 a day to walk up and down the ditch with a ladder to pull the lizards out as part of it. And so what are your thoughts on the Endangered Species Act?
You've heard the revolt coming already here.
Yes. Well, they all want to be lizard watchers. I already know what the deal is.
Well, we have the same thing in southern Utah with the tortoise. We had to hire people to help them escort them across the. We had a tortoise guard walkers. So same thing. Unfortunately, it's not the only area in which we do that. The sad part about the Endangered Species Act and why we're having so much difficulty with it is it was poorly written in the first place. And it was written simply as a means of control. So if something is listed now on the Endangered Species Act, the issue is not on are we saving the species, it's are we using that to control the land area where you find species. And unfortunately, there have been some rules that changed to say that now we're going to look about where a species might be in the future in the ability to control that. What we need to do is reform the Endangered Species Act so the goal is on rehabilitation of species, not simply on control. And that's what we're not doing. We're listing species, but we're not actually doing anything to help them, to facilitate them getting off that list in the future. And that's why it's the least effective act in the itinerary of regulations and acts that this country has.
I hope it's something you're going to work on quickly.
Quickly is, I wish I hadn't put that adverb in there. Yeah, we are going to work on it. It took a long time to get the situation where we are. It's going to take some time to move it back. But yeah, that is one of the things we have to do if we're actually going to get control of our own futures so that the resources and the lands we have are actually going to be used to benefit people and benefit kids and to recreate. We've got to do something with that.
Congressman, let me just suggest, hello again, this is Senator Pete. I know you have trouble hearing me. My voice used to develop stronger. Now it's getting weaker. I guess that's what happens when you get old. But anyway, I wanted to say we all have had endangered species issues. Believe it or not, I came to the Senate in 1972, and every decade thereafter, there were major problems with the endangered species. And everybody predicted we're going to grow and we're going to get this done and we're going to modify and amend, but it never happened. I think maybe we have somebody in Washington that if the issues are properly presented, and the issue is, can we reasonably grow and use our federal lands or not? And I think we're going to end up being able to convince this administration that it can be done without harming whatever the endangered species stood for in the area, without waiting around to amend that law. That might be forever. I think it can be handled administratively in ways that will get large chunks of land developable, that will move ahead. I hope so. It'll bring people like me out of the woodwork if we get somebody that wants to do it. But if you just want to sit and talk about it, we're going to get nowhere, because those who don't want to do it are very well organized. The Endangered Species Act is so amorphous that if you get them running down the right track and it's their track, you're a dead duck. You got to find a way to change the direction of the track and get it going in another direction. With common sense interpretations, you might be able to get some of it done. I hope so.
Thank you. Any thoughts on national monuments? I know you're going to get a big one in 2 weeks.
No, we're not. No, we're not. Here's the problem with national monuments. The Antiquities Act was passed in an era when there were only 45 states. There were absolutely no environmental laws. There was a Forest Service, but there was no Park Service. There was no BLM agency. It was done in an era that's totally different than today, and it's no longer needed. Besides, it is a legislative function given to the executive branch. And the other sad part about the Antiquities Act is it has to be done as a gotcha moment. There's a solicitor's opinion that simply says if the president actually starts dealing with issues and talking to people about it, that will naturally trigger NEPA, in which he has to actually have public comment. So the president, to actually do a monument, has got to be gotcha. It's got to be done without input. And that's why there are so many problems. The problems you have with the monuments in your state are the same thing we have with the Grand Staircase Escalante that was done under President Clinton. It was done without considering what the implications were and without talking to people on the ground to work out these problems ahead of time. You would not have a problem with inholdings of private property as well as school trust lands within these monument designations if you'd actually done it up front to say, let's move those lands and do some trading so that you can actually put the trust lands together and leave the monument there. And that's the problem with every monument that's been designated. If indeed I get another one in Utah, what I hope is that it will be easily overturned, not just by Congress, but by presidential action. And it can be if it violates the criteria of the Antiquities Act. So the Antiquities Act can only be done if there is a specific antiquity you're trying to save. It's got to be a thing. Fish are not antiquities. Trees are not antiquities. If you can prove that it is in imminent danger of being destroyed, and that if it is in the smallest footprint possible to actually save the antiquity. And this administration has also said it has to have public support. Now, there's a potential threat for a monument in my state that has no antiquity designated. It is an antiquity that's not threatened, and it is definitely not, one point. In the debate in Congress, they wanted to put a cap on how much land would be considered, and it was whether it should be like 300 or 120 acres. The suggested monument for Utah would be 1.9 million acres. Right. And there is no local support for that monument. If indeed you have that, I hope that if indeed that monument is designated, I hope we have the criteria then that any president could exercise. He already has the power to reduce the size, could exercise the power to rescind that monument designation. And if not, it will give us the impetus to actually change that. A law that has been around since 1906 needs to be repaired and needs to be updated at the least. In this case, it just needs to be repealed.
I agree. I think one other, and I think we're on the same page. I don't know this, but I think I have an issue with conservation easements personally. I think we're taking federal dollars and we're actually creating additional federal lands through conservation easements. What's your thoughts on that?
At least you're involving people before you go down that path, which is a little bit different than taking it over. And one of the issues, what we have done as chairman the last 2 years in our committee is had hearings all over the place, all with the same concept. We want to see if the rules and regulations and the policies being imposed on states are actually helping or hurting people. And that's the biggest problem we have so far is they are hurting people. So our efforts are coming in there to say, let's look, if you're going to actually have lands, make sure the lands do something that actually is a benefit for people and does not hurt them in some way. And that is why, one of the reasons why I would like to devolve as much of that authority and power and ownership of that land to the state and local governments as possible, is simply because the federal government is not in the manufacturing business. If we were doing a conveyor belt of products, then there is an economy of scale. But the government is a service, and there is no economy of scale in service. And when the bigger the group, the bigger the government entity, the more difficult it is taking into account the needs of people and being just and being fair in those. And that's why if you're really going to make these management and decisions on public lands, and I'm not opposed to public lands. Utah is a public land state. It's always going to be one. It should be one.
That's right.
It's who makes the decisions of those public lands. And if they are done on a state and federal level, then you have a chance of actually having equity, and you have fairness, and you have justice, and you can take individual circumstances into account. My problem is the federal government owns one third of all of America. And it's not that the federal government is inept or incompetent or even mean-spirited. It's just too damn much land to manage effectively.
That's right.
That's why it has to go back to the states.
Well, as far as my idea is returning the minerals to the state of New Mexico for early childhood, what do you think are chances of getting it, Senator Domenici, through the legislature? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I've told you that I'm not informed on the subject, as I will be, because I have done nothing in this area until very recently when you asked me to help you. So I haven't come to any conclusion based upon reasoning. But it seems to me that the return of land to the state, in our case, makes eminent sense, and we ought to have a chance if we do our homework and present it properly. There's no question that nobody's going to get hurt, and on the same token, a lot of people are going to be helped, but of course they can't vote. They're still little babies. They're not grown up yet. But we know that unless we get started with one of our states that's doing so poorly in education and helping them with some assets that we have that are not being used, well, if we don't act on that, we're absolutely denying our own purpose for being where we are.
I agree.
So I think we'll have to work at it, but we ought to get a lot of help when they understand the problem. What will this administration do, or what will they be? I don't know. But I repeat, I think they're going to be for people running their business that move ahead with using our resources for a public good, instead of locking them up to think about them forever. That's one. And number two, I think that they're, in that context, they're going to be for returning some of the lands certainly under specific cases like ours. They're going to end up favoring it. That'd be my guess. We have to present it right, and we have to know who's doing the implementing. But that can be done. I want to say to all of you, I didn't know that you met in such large numbers working on such issues as you have. And I wish I was back in service, but I'm just too far gone to be helpful to you. So I won't be around. I'll have to read about you. But I'm very excited when I see the number of people that come up here on these issues. And Commissioner, it's good to be with you and talking to them. I wonder if sometimes we ought to be helpful to some of them so they would understand that there is a mutuality. We do lock arms and try to make it over that touchdown line on issues. We need help getting there sometimes.
Right. I think somebody has a question.
Somebody has a question?
You should also know, though, Pete, we in the House wish you were back in the Senate, too. And I have some suggestions of who you could replace right now.
Look at that. I mean, I did not come up here looking for a new job. I'm retired. I'm going into second retirement, and I bet you anything I'll still be working.
We hope so.
So if somebody have a question, we'll try.
I do. Can you hear me? Okay. Before we run out of time, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here, and Congressman and Senator, can you kind of give a quick overview of if states were interested in looking at the split estate and looking at bringing those mineral rights, those dollars back to the states, is that in a piece of legislation that we could be looking at as an individual state, or just maybe a little bit more clarification on that?
Thank you, Yvette. The way we're looking at it is two ways. One is at our state legislature, we're looking at creating legislation to create a new beneficiary in our trust area at the permanent fund. And so we need the state legislature to set up that beneficiary. But we can do it as land commissioner if the congressman and Congress is successful. We're working on creating legislation for New Mexico right now. We're not including any other states. If somebody would like to join us, we'd love to do that. But we're going to create legislation to transfer the minerals under split estate in New Mexico. But if someone else would love to join, I think at your state levels, especially if you're in a western state, then we'd love to talk about it.
I'd just like to congratulate and thank Senator Domenici for working a long ahead of time on an issue that ALEC is also working on, which is the deficit and debt of the federal government and the state's initiative in that area. Thank you for heading the Domenici-Rivlin Commission. It was a great success. We still have the problem, but progress is our most important product. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Congressman, thank you for your work on this area. You message this better than anyone. You mentioned that the statehood promises, the law, the contract to relinquish control of the land are the same on both sides of the Rocky Mountains. And so I wonder in Congress where the legal, the constitutional obligation, the statehood document to relinquish land is the same on both sides of the Rockies, what is the argument that you hear in the halls of Congress for not treating states equally when we're founded on equal protection of law and fundamental fairness?
They don't care. No, I'm not trying to be flippant, even though I am. When we have argued fairness, they don't care. But we have tried to talk to friends in the East about this particular issue. There are two arguments in which they do care. Argument number one is if you show the discrepancy in education funding, for some reason they care about kids and they see it is unfair to the kids in the West. Second argument is if you look at all the money we get from royalties that come off public lands and all the expenditures, especially with PILT and SRS and some of the others that we spend on public lands, we spend a whole lot more than we actually receive, which means you look at those in the East and say, you know, sitting back there in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, you have to come up with $11 billion a year out of your pockets for the right to control the West. If you just give us our land back, you can keep your money. They care about that. And those are the only two arguments that seem to resonate with my friends in the East.
I'm State Representative Bob Thorpe, and I just want to tell you how much I appreciate it. I am very versed with the problems associated with national monuments. And certainly I'd ask for everyone from other states, especially eastern states, to understand that we have a unique problem in the West. So for example, New York can spend roughly $20,000 per child for K through 12. And the western states like Arizona, we're able to barely muster about $9,000 per student. And when you think about it, I'm actually jealous of my friend Yvette from New Mexico, because today I learned something that 40% of New Mexico is in private ownership. And I thought they were on par with us. Only 17% of Arizona is in private ownership. So think about where revenue comes from for education. It comes from taxes, property taxes. And when you only have 17% of your state generating property taxes, you're in a pretty bad shape. So my research shows the national monuments in the eastern part of the United States, roughly about 50 to 100 acres per monument on average. The western United States, about 175,000 acres per monument. And Arizona leads the pack in having 22 monuments that have been created. So I truly appreciate your time today, because this is an extremely important problem that needs to be solved for the western states. And I thank all the folks from around the country, and I hope that you'll take notice that western United States our states have a unique problem that you don't experience. Matter of fact, most of you think that BLM stands for Black Lives Matter, and you know, I would trade all the BLM folks that you have to deal with the Bureau of Land Management folks that we have to deal with.
They're giving me the cutoff sign. Usually that's when I say something wrong. But Senator Domenici, I appreciate your time today and the service you've given our country. So I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
And Congressman Bishop, I look forward to working on our bill with you. But thank you for being here today, and thanks for your service and all you do for our state, for your state and our country.
Appreciate the invitation.